On an ordinary winter's morning, just like countless other prisoners before him, a condemned man was escorted from his holding cell across the streets of London to a scaffold where a crowd had gathered to witness an execution. Just like countless others before him, a condemned man walks up to his executioner, kneeled at the stump that was prepared for him, closed his eyes, prayed to Almighty God, and, after a moment, the executioner's axe falls sharply on the condemned man's neck. Only this was no ordinary winter's morning, and this was no ordinary prisoner whom had been condemned. This was Saturday, January 30th, 1649. The condemned man was Charles I, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. When the axe fell on Charles I's neck, the culture of humanity was fundamentally and irreversibly shifted in a manner that we very much still feel to this day. To understand how the death of a single man can send shockwaves throughout space and time in that manner, one has to understand that back in the 17th century, monarchs were not viewed in the same way that we view them today. Since time immemorial, a monarch was no mere mortal, with many cultures viewing their monarchs as living deities walking among them, and the Christian notion of a monarch was intimately tied to the divine right of kings. The best portrayal of the divine right of kings that I have ever encountered was Paul Giamatti's role as King John II in the film Ironclad.
I betray God! My crown was passed to me by my brother and my father before him. I was born to be a king. It is my birthright, given to me by God. You dare to question my reign and the lineage of kings who have reigned before me, who forged this land from barbarian hordes and made it noble and pure, who gave it order, meaning, and even faith to thousands of years of loyal subjects, and it is all now questioned by you. I am the blood! I am God's right hand! And you will never dictate to me how I am to be a king!
Charles I wholeheartedly embodied this spirit, and he believed that he was preordained by God himself to rule. However, this was mixed with an all-too human attitude of inflexibility that directly led to that fateful morning in January 1649. For Charles could not, or would not, accept that a far younger idea had come of age, and that idea was Parliament. The notion, and indeed the practice of Parliament as we understand it today, has its origins from at least the 10th century AD, and over the centuries this forum evolved into two formal bodies, with one being composed of high-born nobles, called the House of Lords, and the other composed of common-born middle-class-like merchants and knights, called the House of Commons, with the latter gradually becoming a source of resistance against the absolute authority of the sovereign and the status quo in general. Ironically, however, it would be a king that gave Parliament its greatest injection of power. Under the direction and impetus of King Henry VIII, laws were created affecting all aspects of national life, especially in religious practice and doctrines, which had previously been under the sole authority of the Pope and the Church. With the unprecedented statutes of the 1530s, no area involved in governments of the realm was outside Parliament's authority. During this reformation, Parliament began realizing that the monarch needed Parliament as much as, if not more so, than it needed the sovereign. This remarkable legislative injection of authority into Parliament would kickstart a chain reaction that could only lead to one destination. Even before Charles would be crowned king in February of 1625, tensions with Parliament had already started rising following his Catholic father's reign of King James I. Charles's troubles began when he secured a match with French Princess Henrietta Maria, to which he had married by proxy on the 1st of May 1625. You see, Parliament was against the king's marriage to a Catholic princess, as they feared that such a match would undermine the Church of England and resulting in the lifting of restrictions against Catholic practices. To make things worse, Henrietta Maria would not attend the coronation of her husband and king, because she would not participate in a Protestant religious ceremony. And then, to add insult to injury, in the same year, Charles would appoint an anti-Puritan to the position of the royal chaplain, Puritanism being the religious practice followed by the bulk of parliamentarians. Tensions between the new king and Parliament started spiraling around the matter of the war against Spain. Parliament would not fund an all-out war, preferring instead to fund the hunting of the Spanish treasure fleets. Parliament approved a royal collection on tonnage and poundage, essentially what we now know today as customs duties, for a year to fund said expeditions. This was a far cry from the war plans that Charles had in mind, but he needed to start from somewhere. Thus, in 1625, the Lord Admiral 1st Duke of Buckingham, a close confidant to the crown, set off with 100 ships and high expectations, but returned with less than 40 and abject failure. Parliament called for Buckingham's head, both metaphorically and literally, but Charles sided with his friend and promoted him for Chancellor of Cambridge University, as well as arresting vocal parliamentarians. Parliament retaliated by withholding any future funds as long as Buckingham was in command and still influencing the crown. However, Charles, feeling deeply insulted by its insistence over his divine royal authority, hence decided to dissolve Parliament. Undeterred, Charles, wanting to press on with his war against the Spanish, imposed a new tax in the form of forced loans without parliamentary consent in November of 1627. And even though this was within the king's royal prerogative, it will cause substantial domestic unrest, resulting in Charles summoning Parliament back in March of 1628. What followed would later form one of the fundamental rights of modern citizens. In May, Parliament put forward a petition of right, which called upon the sovereign to acknowledge that he could not levy taxes, impose martial law on civilians, imprison them without due process, or quarter his troops in their homes without parliamentary consent. Charles reluctantly assented to this on the 7th of June, in order to secure more funding for the war. The importance of this event must not go understated. The Petition of Right is considered today to be of equal importance to the Magna Carta as well as the Essays of Clarendon, which are both also considered as foundational documents of our modern human rights. Charles, irked by Parliament's audacity, would not take such an insult lightly and shortly thereafter prorogued Parliament. Without the support of Parliament to raise funds and without any form of permanent direct taxation as we know it today, Charles had to sue for peace with both France and Spain by the end of the decade, ruling as an absolute monarch for 11 years, in which he would work hard to regain his lost authority as a sovereign. Charles resorted to raising money through unpopular and some would say illegal means. He found and used all but forgotten laws. He imposed ship money and reinstated the tonnage and poundage tax, both of which were supposed to be only collected through parliamentary approval. He sold grants for monopolies, imposed annual rents on the Scottish nobility, as well as expanding the boundaries of royal forests in order to fine and exploit land users. All of these measures made Charles very unpopular with the nobility, the gentry, the yeomanry, and even the poor. He eventually set his sights on imposing his misguided will on the theological practices of his kingdom, and when Charles decided to impose a new Book of Common Prayer in Scotland in 1637, widespread anger and social unrest quickly rose, and by February of the following year, this resistance coalesced into the National Covenant and armed rebellion. The First Bishops' War would be short, lasting only a few weeks, not very bloody, and very humiliating for the king, being labelled back home as King Charles's Northern Follies. But if he was going to be able to deal with the rebellious Covenanters permanently, he would need the support of the English Parliament. Thus, in April of 1640, Parliament set for its first session in 11 years in order for Charles to secure the funds he needed for war. However, by now it had become obvious that the king needed Parliament as much as it needed him. Spearheaded by John Pym, the House of Commons called for the Crown to address its many abuses over the past decades. This led to Charles dissolving Parliament once again just after 3 weeks to silence the insubordination. However, by turning to Parliament, Charles showed that he needed them to be able to govern, and they would bide their time, for they only needed to wait for the king to dig an even deeper hole for himself. In July, he became desperate enough to seize the silver bullion and various company stocks held in trust at the Mint of the Exchequer in the Tower of London. By August, the Scottish Covenanters sent an army south, into England itself. And the Second Bishops' War would be even worse for Charles, with the Covenanters invading as far south as Newcastle and Charles folding by September before even a battle could take place. The truce signed was a disaster for the Crown and England, allowing the Scots to occupy Northumberland and County Durham until a final agreement could be reached, forcing Charles to recall Parliament again in November. This time round, Parliament issued a series of reforms that would cement its authority and take control of the chambers from the king. Given that Parliament was not willing or able to go after the king himself, they were determined to hold his advisors to account and to show the king that he could not protect them. They called for the head of the Earl of Stafford, who had urged Charles to use military force in order to seize the Mint at the Tower of London. John Pym once again led the charge, and the axe fell on Stafford's neck on the 12th of May 1641. By August, Parliament would agree to pay off the Covenanters to return back north of the border and end hostilities. It would also declare that any taxes whatsoever levied without its consent to be unlawful, as well as centralizing legal authority around itself by abolishing long-standing royal courts. In return for all this, Parliament would agree to pay off Charles's mounting debts. The year, however, would keep getting worse for the king, as in November the House of Commons passed the Grand Remonstrance, which argued that the king was a victim of a grand Catholic conspiracy and that his advisors were mostly to blame for the unrest caused by his decisions. The notion of a papist conspiracy spread like wildfire across England, and anti-Catholic sentiments rose to new heights. Now Parliament pushed even harder, intending to pass a militia bill that would take command of the army from the king and give it to itself, which was vociferously opposed by the House of Lords as well as, of course, by Charles. The last straw for the king, however, came when Parliament turned its gaze to the Queen Henrietta Maria for supposedly conspiring with Irish rebels. On the 3rd of January 1642, Charles issued a warrant for 5 MPs on the grounds of high treason for colluding with the Covenanters during the Bishops' Wars. The wanted men fled the city by boat as the king was on his way to Parliament, at the head of an armed guard. What followed was portrayed in the movie Cromwell, which has its faults, but I believe Alec Guinness's portrayal of Charles I was spot on.
What? Gentlemen! The king comes! He comes with 100 men at arms! Stand aside, gentlemen, if you please. Halt! Open in the name of the king!
I have here a warrant for the arrest of 5 members of this House upon a charge of treason. I see that the birds have flown. Mr. Speaker, where are these gentlemen?
May it please your Majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak, except as this House gives me leave.
So be it. This Parliament is, by my authority, terminated, dissolved.
Charles was forced to leave Parliament empty-handed, humiliated, and politically ruined, for he not only failed to capture his wanted man and thereby assert his authority, but he did so whilst invading the House of Commons and breaching parliamentary privilege, something no other monarch had done before him. In one fell swoop, Charles destroyed what support he had left in Parliament, who quickly seized the opportunity to seize London by the 10th, forcing the king to flee his own capital. By March, Parliament passed the Militia Ordinance, which did not need the assent of the sovereign, giving itself the force of arms that it had lacked so far. This split the two houses of Parliament hard, as the Lords saw this unilateral move as an attempt to usurp power from the crown. There was no turning back from this, and Charles headed to Nottingham, where on the 22nd of August 1642 he raised his royal standard and declared that all of Parliament were traitors to the crown, thus formally igniting a civil war. The English Civil War lasted for 5 years and was proportionally as bloody as the First World War. However, this was not just a senseless conflict between two powers sending countless men, women, children and animals to the slaughter. This was about the war between the old ways of privilege and divine rights versus the new ways of nationhood and self-determination. For when Parliament emerged victorious in 1647, Western and consequently global civilization would be put on a course that would shape the world that we still live in to this day. However, before all that could happen, there was still one important thing that needed to be determined. And that is what to do with King Charles I, who by the end of the Civil War ended up being a prisoner of Parliament. Army radicals had wanted to remove the king altogether, to rest power solely on the House of Commons, as well as pushed for native rights, such as freedoms of conscience, freedoms from conscription, as well as equality before the law. Oliver Cromwell, who wielded immense power in Parliament by the end of the Civil War, flatly refused to accept any scenario that involved the overthrow of the monarch. Charles, however, managed his escape on the 11th of November from Hampton Court Palace, where he was being held, and sought to escape to France, but he was recaptured on the Isle of Wight and reconfined in Carisbrooke Castle. Desperate for a way out of his predicament, Charles secretly negotiated with the Scottish Covenanters to invade England on his behalf, in order to restore him to the throne upon the condition that he would accept the National Covenant as well as establish Presbyterianism in England for at least 3 years. It took till May for the Scots to invade, taking Parliament off guard, but they would be decisively defeated by August. With all royalist hopes finally crushed, Charles attempted to negotiate it with Parliament for a settlement, but the army opposed negotiations with a king who had betrayed his own people by calling for an army of Scotsmen to invade and murder his own subjects, with Oliver Cromwell now calling for the removal of the king. By the 2nd of December 1648, Sir Thomas Fairfax moved the army and the king to London, establishing his headquarters at Whitehall. On the 5th, Parliament voted in favour of resuming negotiations with the king. Thus, on the 6th, 2 regiments under Colonel Thomas Pride were ordered to purge Parliament from anyone who was in any way supportive of the monarch by not letting them into the chambers. The Rum Parliament, as this later became known, voted on the 7th to end negotiations with the king, with just 80 out of the 470 eligible MPs present. But the most pertinent question remained, for if Parliament just decided that they will not be negotiating with the king, what happens next? Parliament had put monarchs on trial before Charles, however never a reigning monarch, and Charles I was still very much the reigning monarch, and any trial and subsequent sentencing would have to be done against what was, for time immemorial, the highest authority in the land, and against what was universally recognized to be the source of all legal and moral authority, as well as the physical embodiment of the representative of the divine on earth. The Rum Parliament argued that since they are the representatives of the people of England, and that the king is to be put on trial by those same representatives, therefore the authority under which Parliament was to try the king was to be the people of England. This was an unconventional notion, to say the least, as before this moment all authority had been vested to the king by God. The notion of nationhood, as we know it today, was still in its inception, and the idea that the authority to govern a people came from the people being governed was altogether alien and absurd. Regardless, a High Court of Justice was set up to try Charles I for high treason in the name of the people of England. On the 20th of January, the trial of King Charles I began, but he refused to enter a plea, claiming that no court had jurisdiction over a monarch, rightfully so according to all laws of the time. Charles insisted that the trial was illegal and maintained that he was above prosecution. The court challenged the doctrine of sovereign immunity and stated that the King of England was not a person, but an office whose every occupant was entrusted with a limited power to govern. The court pressed again and again that the prisoner must enter a plea, to which Charles retorted,
I am no ordinary prisoner, sir.
Parliament removed Charles from the court and proceeded with the trial as if he had pleaded guilty. However, in order to substantiate and legitimize the trial in the eyes of England and history, the prosecution still summoned its witnesses to give testimony, without the king present. Even though the trial's verdict was a foregone conclusion, the consequences were not as clear. The possible ramifications, both political and theological, were not lost on the Rum Parliament, and many of the commissioners would refuse to sign the warrant calling for the execution of the king for high treason, and in the end only 28 would sign the warrant on the 29th of January 1649. And thus, on an extraordinary winter's morning, unlike any other prisoner before him, a condemned king was escorted from his holding cell across the streets of London to a scaffold, where a crowd had gathered to witness an execution. Unlike anyone else before him, a condemned king walked up to his executioner, kneeled at the stump prepared for him, closed his eyes, prayed to Almighty God, and after a moment, the executioner's axe fell sharply on the king's neck. The tale of Charles I marks a key turning point in the story that makes up our lives today. For with his execution, the ideas of parliament, nationhood, and self-determination all made their presence in the world felt, for they managed to overthrow a king and hold him to account by a power that derives its authority from the common people. The days of divine rights and privileges were now numbered, for just over 100 years later, another king would suffer the same fate just across the channel. A monarch was no longer God's right hand on earth. A monarch was no longer divine. He was no longer above the law. A monarch had become human, corruptible, accountable.